So I'm hoping this video will answer a lot of commonly asked questions we get about these OBD1 Honda ECUs, and maybe even serve as sort of a buyer's guide. So let's start with identifying your ECU. And we're going to be going over socketed ECUs, not necessarily the factory ones. So that means that a socket has been inserted here so you can add a chip or an emulator board. There's also a couple other components on the board that will be added along with that as well. So very often these part number stickers are removed from the board with these socketed ECUs, and that's done to honestly just simplify selling them, because people are usually looking for a P28. Now this one's actually a P28. Usually an ECU that you are told is a P28 really is not, especially if that sticker's been removed. It's almost definitely not. Now it really doesn't matter that it's not an original P28 once it's been socketed, as once VTEC components have been added in, the board's been socketed, and you're running your own tune on here, not the factory one, it's essentially the exact same thing. You won't notice any difference between an original and a modified or converted P28. So the one here we have today is a customer's ECU that was sent in. Let's see what he wanted here. So I've got a small note on here that says this ECU has some water damage, and he wants the case cut out for a Honda S300, which the board is already set up for, but the shell doesn't have the cutout for the USB port. And he also wants boost by gear added to the ECU. So anytime I get an ECU in, no matter what they want done to the ECU, I'm always going to look it over and run a diagnostic on it as well, and let them know anything else that I think they need done to their ECU. And right off the bat, I saw a couple things here that I wanted to address on this customer's ECU, and this is also stuff you should be looking for when purchasing an ECU, because there's a good chance if you buy one secondhand or from a non-reputable seller that you're going to get one in rough condition that's going to need some work done to it, which isn't really a big deal, but you want to know what it's going to need before you spend, $200-300 on an ECU that's going to need another $200 of work to be worth the original money you paid for it. So I'm just going to look over the back on this board, take a look at the solders, because I know it was socketed, and I can see that it wasn't done very well. There's not very good penetration on these solders. They didn't bother to clean the flux, and it just looks pretty rough overall, so I'll probably want to go over and redo that. They've also got a jumper on the back side of J1, while J1 is on the front side as well, so I'm not sure what's going on there. I also see that the C51 and C52 capacitors have been removed for some reason, and there is a decent bit of corrosion going on in that area as well. So I don't necessarily see any water damage on the board itself. I do see some corrosion around here from where some moisture has sat on the board for a bit, but the board itself actually doesn't seem to be in too bad of shape, besides being totally filthy and maybe having a little bit of corrosion from capacitor leakage, but we can't quite see that yet. So that's one of the main things you want to look for on these ECUs, is the capacitors. So these boards were made around a time where there were a lot of defective and low quality capacitors on the market, and unfortunately every single OBD1 Honda ECU was equipped with these defective capacitors. So over time, especially now 30 years later, almost all of these have started leaking acid onto the board, some worse than others. This one does not seem too bad. I'm not seeing too much acid underneath these capacitors, but usually with this main one here, when you pop it up, you'll see quite a bit more there. So even though I'm not seeing a lot of leakage on the board, there is still some that will cause problems in the future. So I did recommend a refurbish to this customer, and we are going to go ahead with that, along with the boost control components that he wants. And then I'm going to touch some other stuff up for him too while I've got this here, because I don't like sending stuff out in that condition. So if you run into an ECU that you find on Facebook Marketplace, eBay, something like that, and you see that it's got original capacitors, always look for leakage around there. If there's corrosion on the board, I'll put up a picture here of what that looks like. If there's corrosion on the board, it could need some major repair, where this one here is most likely just going to need the capacitors removed and our refurbish service done to the board. So if you see that it's got original capacitors, expect to spend between, let's say, $80 and $150, depending on who you get the service done through, for a refurbished service to be done on the board. If the socket kit looks like this or worse, expect for maybe some repair to need to be done there as well. If the socket kit is working when you get the ECU, you got a little better chance that it won't. But something like this, I feel, will probably cause issues in the future. So we're going to address that right away today. And then another thing. So if you have a VTEC engine, you are going to need a VTEC ECU. Now, there is a bunch of them that came VTEC from the factory. There's the P28, the P30, the P72, and probably a few others I'm not thinking of right now. But it's very easy to convert a non-VTEC ECU to VTEC, and a lot of the unstickered ones are going to be converted. So things to look for here. Mainly, right here at IC14, it's always going to be in the same spot on all these ECUs. If there is a transistor here, that is this black thing here I'm pointing to, it's been converted to VTEC. I can see that this one is original because it has the blue tantalum capacitor at C60. Usually when it's been converted, you'll see a yellow one there. And I can also see that no one's been in here in that area. Those are factory solders there. But like I said, it does not matter if it's been converted. As long as it's been done properly, it's going to function exactly the same as a factory VTEC ECU would. Also just noticing here that somebody has tried to remove this component here and then put it back, and they did a pretty bad job there. So we'll probably fix that too while this is here. Alright, so the socket type. If the ECU that you're buying has been socketed, you're going to have to check out the socket type and see if it's going to work with the application you want to use. So this ECU in specific has been set up for a Hondata. It's got male header pins on the 28-pin socket and male header pins on the 4-pin CN2 data log socket. This ECU will only work with a Hondata S300. There's not going to be anything else that's going to plug directly onto this socket and work. So if you wanted to run a chip or a different emulator like a Snake MU, a Cobra RTP, or any of the other options, this is not going to work without some major modification, which will be pretty expensive. Now, there is converter boards you can get. If you wanted to run a chip on this socket, that's no problem. We do make and sell a converter board that goes right on there, and now you can run a chip. However, if you wanted to run another emulator, you're going to need to have this extracted and replaced with the proper socket. So the male pins are generally going to be for a Hondata. This is a leaf socket. A leaf socket will generally be used for just a standard 28-pin chip like this here. These SST chips, which are pretty obsolete these days. And this is a machine socket here. It's got the round pins on there. This is honestly what you're going to want if you want to run a chip or any other emulator aside from the Hondata. This will support pretty much every other emulator on the market, and as well as the old school SST chips. I suppose this is a good time, since we're on the topic, to talk about chips and emulators, because a lot of people don't know the difference or the importance. So back in the day, when people would chip these ECUs and tune them, they would generally use an old EEPROM chip like this. This lets you store a tune on here, plug it into the ECU, and then if you want to make adjustments to that tune, you're going to need to pull that chip out and use a chip burner like this. These are pretty expensive these days. I'd say about $100 for a chip burner, which in comparison to the emulator options, it's a no-brainer. You should just go with an emulator these days. There's no point in sitting here and pulling these chips out and putting them in a chip burner when you could just use a more modern device like an emulator board that plugs right into your laptop and can do live tuning, live data logging, and you never have to pull it out of there again. It's just in there forever. It's great. Now, if you do want to go with a chip setup today, you do need to be careful because these old SST chips have not been available for a long time. So if you're buying a chip online that looks like this one here, it's got the SST logo on it, there's a good chance it's fake. And a lot of the chip burners will not reburn these chips. So there's been a lot of modern reproductions of these chips, and they look like this. It converts a 32-pin PLCC chip to the standard DIP28 connection. These are roughly 10-15 bucks usually for most sellers. Now, if you want to use the chip setup, you're likely going to want to be able to monitor the data in your ECU. Now, that is possible through a few ways. These days, it's the cheapest to go with a Bluetooth data logger like this. It's a small HC05 module that plugs right onto your 4-pin header, and now you can connect this to your laptop, your phone, whatever, and monitor data the same way you would be able to with one of these devices. You still need to pull the chip to change the tune, but you can view what it's doing through that. But like I said, these days it just doesn't make sense to get all of this old technology here when you could just replace it with a board like this for an extra, I don't know, 50 bucks, if even. So there's tons of emulator options. I've got a couple here. I've got the old Demon 2 board. These were pretty popular back in the day, but are not available anymore, unfortunately. And I've been getting a lot of them showing up dead and not working anymore. So these days, the most common replacement for the Demon board is going to be the Snake OBD1 MU. This is the version 2. This has Bluetooth, live tuning, live data logging, everything that the Demon board would have, or everything that a Hondata board would have. Just uses different software than the Hondata. I don't have a Hondata here to show, but those have been around for, 20 years now. It is a good product. It's just the price is a little expensive for most people, where those are $600. One of these is $200, $250. All right, so going back to the ECU. Like I said, this customer wanted a boost control kit installed, and I've also sold a refurbish on it as it's in pretty rough shape. And then I'll probably be reflowing his chip socket for him as well and cleaning up this garbage here. So I'm going to get this stripped down, and then I will show you what the board looks like with all the capacitors removed, and you'll probably be able to see a bit more acid on there as well. Alright, so I've got my bench tester hooked up. I've got a test socket installed in the ECU, and then I've also got a Bluetooth data logger installed. Every ECU that comes in is going to get the exact same test. We're going to check to make sure your chip socket's making good connection, make sure your data log's working, and then check over all the basic engine functions here. So hopefully the camera will pick this up. So I've got the engine running here, and on the left side you can see the 4 injectors are firing normally as they should. Increase RPM. And it is going all the way to redline. Next to that, you can see the ICM. That's the ignition control module that is firing correctly. To the right of that is the MIL. We have no check engine light. That is good. Next to that would be your VTEC switch, which is engaging. Green light there is going to be the fuel pump. And we've got some critical sensors over here. Everything does appear to be running good on this ECU. Chip socket looks good, making good connection. And then I'm going to run a data log test right now. Alright, so we've got HTS open here, and I've just got a P28 ROM open. I'm going to go to the settings, make sure our Bluetooth data log is turned on. And I've already got my data logger paired with this laptop. We're just going to click data log, connect, and there we go. We've got working data log. And I'm just going to go over all of the sensors on here and make sure everything's reading correctly. Looks good. Everything's working correctly. We've got full data log, and so the ECU is in working condition. However, it is still going to need that refurbished so we can make sure this thing lasts for the next 30 years. Alright, so I've got all the capacitors removed, and I've got all the solder removed from the holes, as well as where I'm putting in the boost control kit. So you can see that there is a decent bit of corrosion right here, and then good amount of acid sitting on the board under all the capacitors. So now we're gonna get this board cleaned up and we'll be right back. All right, so I've got the board cleaned, stripped, I've got any acid neutralized, and as you can see right there, there is a bit of corrosion on the board. Needs to be treated, so we're gonna deal with that before we put this thing back together and get it recoated. All right, so we've got the corrosion repaired, as you can see. Just a bit of solder mask, UV cured solder mask, and now we're ready to put this thing back together. All right, we've got new capacitors installed. PWM boost control kit is installed, and now I need to clean the back side of the board, deal with this, and recoat, and this should be good to go. All right, I've got the board cleaned and stripped, both sides, ready for recoat. All right, there it is, complete, refurbished boost control kit. Looking pretty good. There's only so much I could do about the socket kit. They used some pretty crappy solder in there too, but everything's making good connection. It's just not as pretty as I would like it to be. But yeah, this one's good to go. Should last another 30 years, no problem.